Hey folks, now, to be fair, this Jordan Peterson guy is very charismatic. He seems to be in touch with how a lot of young men feel. He seems to hit at a critique of what they call the politically correct culture, or the way the academic left is operating, and he's quite critical of it, and that is something a lot of people want to hear. And to be honest, I didn't really want to make another video about him, but when I saw the way he's talking about Marxism and socialism, and how full of just, plain ignorance that his comments are, I almost had no choice. Now, you watch, there's many clips of Jordan Peterson talking about Marxism, and basically his argument is this. He says, oh my gosh, the fact that any academic or any person in academia, postmodernist, academic, and the fact that any of them call themselves Marxists or study the writings of Marx is just outrageous, crazy, stupid, because everyone knows that in the 20th century, all Marxism did was create repressive regimes. He talks about the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, North Korea, says these are awful regimes. That's what Marxism created, so therefore, because of that, no one should take seriously the ideas of Marxism. And this, not only is it based on some misconceptions, but it just reeks of pure ignorance. First of all, let's back up. Karl Marx was not living in the 20th century. He never lived to see the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. And when the Chinese Revolution happened, when the Russian Revolution happened, there was a whole current of Marxists that didn't support it. In fact, I would say probably the majority of the Marxists in the world at that time were what you would call social democrats, people who didn't believe in the Bolshevik ideas of Lenin and the Vanguard Party and such, and instead, were in the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or the British Labour Party, eventually was led by Tony Blair, or building labor unions, were kind of reformists. The majority of people that identified with Marx's teachings had nothing to do with Bolshevism. So for him to say that Marx himself, that all of Marx's ideas are refuted by the events of Bolshevism, is absurd. Furthermore, and I will say this, and this isn't going to make me popular, but it needs to be said, the way he characterizes the socialist governments of the 20th century is also inaccurate. He says that a lot of awful things went on, and then he ends it at that. But who beat Adolf Hitler? What army took Berlin? Who was it that first conquered outer space? Who invented the AK-47 rifle? Russia went from being an agrarian, third world, impoverished country to being a world superpower in a generation. China went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to today, it's led by a Marxist-Leninist party, a party that believes in Marxist-Leninist ideology, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory. This party is now leading a state-run economy the country is, at this point, the second largest economy in the world. It's lifted 700 million people out of poverty. Cuba is just a tiny island, but all over the world there are Cuban doctors providing medical aid to people. All over the world, this tiny island of Cuba has a reputation for a very effective medical system and is a humanitarian country that's aiding people. So this notion that all Marxism ever created is mass poverty and dictatorships and suffering is just completely inaccurate. The Marxist movement is far bigger than what went on in the oppressed or global South countries during the 20th century. First of all, it's a widespread movement that includes the people that built the labor unions, the people that built the British Labour Party, social democrats, all kinds of people. And in addition to that, a lot more went on in the 20th century than simply death and suffering. A lot of people were raised out of poverty. In fact, Russia and China, two countries that are now world superpowers, became superpowers when they were led by parties that believed in Marxism. So the entire premise of his argument is just really founded on ignorance, and he gets away with it because, he's Canadian, but he's preaching mainly to a Canadian and American audience. And in these countries, you can get away with this, In the United States, we don't have a Labor Party. We don't have a big Marxist left. We haven't had one really since the 1930s. You had the 1960s New Left, but they weren't really exactly Marxist, I wouldn't say. There were Marxist currents, but because of that, because of this kind of logical fallacy, and because of Cold War indoctrination, he's essentially able to get away with completely mischaracterizing all kinds of things and arguing that one of the most important thinkers of Western history, Karl Marx, the person whose ideas deeply impacted human civilization like no other, arguing that his ideas simply shouldn't be studied. because of his interpretation of events in the global South countries of the 20th century. That's just completely logically fallacious. Whether or not you think Marx's ideas are correct, you've got to admit they had a huge impact on the world, and know that that impact wasn't just death, suffering, and misery. So Jordan Peterson, it's ignorance ultimately. It's just pure ignorance. He has no clue what Marxism really is. He thinks, that you can say, oh, because Stalin did something bad, Marxism therefore should never be studied, and that's just ridiculous.